this gets me to the notion of intangible capital because you talked about moving a lot of the industrial output, real physical goods, hardware, and all that moving offshore, and I think much of the value add for first world economies comes in the form of intangible capital. The marketing, the graphic design, social media, someone in charge of a Twitter account, and all that kind of thing. So, what do you think of the notion of intangible capital? Is that it's a bit nebulous, which makes it kind of hard to determine value coming out of that space, right?
So when you say intangible capital, are you talking about like what companies will keep on their balance sheet that's just like what they nebulously call like goodwill and all that other stuff? Or do you mean stuff like software?
It would be I guess maybe the certain business forms or like organizational practices. There's something called I forgot the name of it. Agile. I hear that a lot it's sort of a method for getting work done, and it kind of strips things down to a certain 4-week, 5-week timeline. I think that might be one aspect of intangible capital.
So you mean by like techniques used in production?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that that's very. There's two ways to increase productivity, right? You can make it so that you can use technologies, or you can have techniques that are more productive. And that's, I think, well established by every school. I will say that, stuff like social media marketing and all that other kind of stuff wouldn't necessarily fall into it. Like is this technique of, marketing and
at first I had said marketing, even graphic design. That's not a very good example either. That's not super intangible. Things like certain organizational practices and camaraderie. That's a better example. I did conflate the two a moment ago. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important though to talk about advertising and that kind of stuff because it drives almost the whole economy of cyberspace, and the stuff that unless you have Patreons or donations or whatever, you're making money off of ads if you have a website, and it goes to the heart of I think the rent-seeking turn in a lot of developed countries. It's resulted from that kind of post-industrial society and neoliberalism as well. I think that we have gotten bad at rationalizing and making production more efficient, including by finding better techniques or investing more in labor-saving technologies. And this is a consequence of it. The cause, in my opinion, is just that labor has become very cheap relative. Maybe this is changing, or maybe this is just a blip, but who knows? But for many, many years since the 70s, labor was relatively cheap. Part of that was globalization. Part of that was destruction of unions. But when labor is cheap, and this is a thing that historians of economic historians have seen. If you go back and study like ancient economies and going back thousands of years, is when labor is cheap, you don't see any kind of innovation. So because you don't have to, you can just get other people to do it for you. And I think that's our problem now.
It's weird because the people who are generally pro-growth, pro-immigration, they also talk a pretty good game about innovation. It's all sort of the same Cato Institute kind of way of framing things. So I think among the kind of neoliberal center-right, the idea that innovation and abundance of labor are somehow at odds, they would disagree. But it seems quite intuitive to me that the statement you just said about labor shortages leading to greater innovation is sort of as a necessity, I suppose.
And necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. If you can't
Yeah.
afford to get someone to do it, you have to jerry-rig it. Got to come up with some new process.
Have you heard of the economist? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You broke up a minute ago. Have you heard of the economist Julian Simon, the late economist?
I know I haven't.
Yeah, he was very much pro. He had kind of a kind of economistic right wing, but humanistic kind of outlook. And by that I mean, he was like, more and more people creates greater and greater innovation, because you never know where the next Einstein might come from, that kind of thing. So you're suggesting kind of the opposite, actually, that the fewer people, the more greater possibility of like an Einstein, but for industry, or something like that.
No, I would actually agree with that logic, but there's two different kinds of tendencies here. One is relative abundance of labor, and the other is just the general size of the population, the economy. Because I think there's something to that kind of big numbers of, and I think Nassim Taleb touches on this kind of, like this is probably, like if you have a bunch of, like one of the virtues of the market, and I will give it this, is that it, by atomizing or production or having a lot of like random people involved in trying to innovate, or by increasing the number of people trying to tackle a given problem, you're more likely to find a solution. You're more likely to have like random genius effects with that kind of decentralization. But it's not necessarily. I mean, there's all different kinds of tendencies here. A counter tendency to this is just the fact that research and development has, by necessity, become more collaborative and more expensive, because the kind of things that individual genius can come up with are kind of exhausted. I mean, if it's easy enough for one person to come up with, they probably already come up with it by now. A lot of the really hard problems and technologies that we're trying to do now are big research projects that are being tackled on an almost industrial scale.
Yeah. Is that due to, are those large numbers of collaborative endeavors due to the execution of the idea, or just the ideation process itself? I guess.
I mean, part of it is ideation. I will say that we've had a lot of trouble with implementation. I think. Let me say this. I think that that certainly applies to ideation, but we've also had trouble, I think, implementing a lot of our innovations because of that relative labor abundance. And that this is a similar but not exactly the same problem that the Soviet Union had in its later years. Yeah. That they had a lot of money going towards both like science and research and development, but also trying to implement and invest in new technologies. And the reason that they couldn't implement those technologies is different from ours, in that the managers of the enterprises had no incentive to. Because more efficient production mean they had less access to resources. But we still have the same problem in that we overcome this only barely by just throwing huge amounts of money at the problem. A lot of times through financial stock bubbles, like the .com bubble, produced some great innovations at great expense to society. And this has come as state-sponsored research has kind of gone on the downtrend.
Yeah, it's the jury is out on just how destructive something like social media really is. It's interesting when you go back to like the 70s and the Clean Water Act, Clean Air and Water Act, and all of that. The negative externalities were more evident. They were fairly obvious. We're getting into this kind of post-material realm, and the problems are more nuanced, more psychological, more difficult to tease out. Somewhat of a tangent here, but yeah, it makes me think about that.
No, I would agree 100%, and I think there's a little case study example that illustrates this best. Have you ever heard of a field of psychology and sociology called sociometrics?
No, but it sounds like the measuring of social indicators of some kind, or
Yeah, so it's basically just measuring interactions between people. You know, like those network graphs. That's where this came from.
yeah.
And this came from a guy named I think it was J.L. Moreno in the 20s and 30s. And his idea behind this was that we're going to map out these social connections between people so that we can, you ideally would have a healthy social atom, and that you as an individual be connected to a bunch of different other individuals, and this is a healthy social experience, what it would look like mathematically, empirically. And we could use this to study, to help people basically become socialized with, like, integrate into society and have overcome loneliness and have friends and
so like a
support network.
Proto-social network sort of theorizing on this.
Yes.
Yeah.
But guess how, like, sociometrics today isn't used towards that. It's used either for pure research, academic research purposes, or it's used to have better advertising. Okay. And I think that's a damn shame that we have this technology, we have this ability to use social media to better help people and connect them to each other, but we don't, because there's no incentive to.
Right. Yeah. The social network companies have this much more kind of myopic focus.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. That's something that the defenders of the market, it's sort of a blind spot that I think they're just sort of constitutionally unable to really see, because of the very kind of methodological individualism. There's you and me talking right now, and the kind of micro welfare that we gain from it, and then there's some other group over there and some other group over there. Any sort of overarching sense of like shared kind of long-term welfare, it's very difficult to ascertain, because a lot of the Anglo-American economic theory has made it that way.
Yeah. I have hope that we'll overcome it. So I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of how you could create a parallel cyberspace infrastructure that would allow these kind of things. And I'm very intrigued by what's called the venture communism model that came out of a radical group in Germany just like 10 years ago or something. And the idea is that
VC, but venture communism. Nice.
Yes. Okay. Is a little play on words there. Yeah. And the idea is that you can have like software production. The problem with open source software for solving this problem is that there's no economic incentive to like produce it on the level of commercial software, of like the nice user interfaces, the customer service, like the development side. It's all just hobbyists playing around, and particularly implied for hobbyists, but there's some exceptions. What we need is a model that allows for production of software on a continual basis for these purposes, without having the negative profit motive attached. And the idea was basically just, we'll have one kind of organization that has all the capital, and the actual production will take place with people renting that capital from this org and growing that stock as a result. But they're not actually like, they get their labor value added. They're not like making any money. They're not making profits from capital ownership and the actual capital or technology and machinery owning enterprise side of it doesn't create any profit either. They just create a fixed amount of rent extracted from the labor value added enterprises.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a bit confusing.
Some kind of state subsidy would help in this effort, or maybe just some kind of endlessly wealthy and philanthropic individuals. I don't know. Both of them seem like they could be interrupted at any time. In the U.S., state capacity. There's been some question. They claim the term is state capacity. Are we even able to do something like that? You know, the arch example would be we couldn't even go back to the moon if we wanted to because of diminished state capacity. You know, would state capacity now allow for something like that, or is there a certain amount of constant regime uncertainty at this point that would completely interrupt any sort of long-term effort like this? Individual, public.
So this is actually a private. The only problem with this, the reason it hasn't happened, isn't because once you get it started, you could probably get it going on it could support itself. Is the idea. The only problem is getting the initial capital to do these things, which, I mean, there's no reason for banks to really loan to this kind of thing where they're not, and there's no as yet big philanthropic money being put towards it. I mean, the first step to actually do this, I think, would you probably want to create some kind of payment processor, which is how Elon Musk and what's his name, the other big guy,
Peter Thiel,
yeah, made their fortunes.
PayPal, right.
But I mean, that's just a vague idea. But in terms of the state and what it can do, I mean, the state can. It has the ability to step in and say, we're going to start doing more product. They could do something like it. And even after World War II, we had like the Springfield Armory was still a thing, which was still creating like guns and stuff for the government. It was a government-owned institution, and it had lots of success in World War II, and they just shut it down because the private contractors could do this for us. I think that the state doesn't want to actually take responsibility and do these things because it means that investors won't get any gain from it or direct gain from it, which, like, there's a lot of political power against that.
State actors themselves are investors, so it's not even like
right. But bureaucrats don't benefit the way that like venture capitalists do.
Right, bureaucrats don't. Senators and Congress people are shareholders, and so they're sort of wedded to private sector uber alles in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean,
permanent civil state bureaucrats, though, they would be maybe most poised to be congenial to this idea, but they're not going to have as much input as the private sector CEOs or kind of interested parties in the public sector who are making money off private sector wealth generation. So
yeah.
Would you call yourself a market socialist?
I mean, I'm not. I would just say a socialist. I don't have any particular like inclination towards markets. I certainly have. I found certain defenses of central planning to be compelling, coming from people like Paul Cockshott. But I'm not. I don't see the. I mean, what ends up? There's certain things that we have to do, and whether we achieve those things by planning or some kind of market mechanism will be determined in that process. Yeah.
It's somewhat ironic that the whole calculation debate of the 20s, primarily 1920s. At the time, I think the right wing, as it were, had the upper hand in that debate. But over time, as there's sort of like this techno capital monopoly convergence in like the way that China is run and the way the U.S. is, with very kind of centralized information. This goes way above my pay grade. I can't really get into the technicalities of this in any way, but with the amount of information and at the hands of a Google or an Amazon, the problem of calculation of dispersed information everywhere might actually be overcome, not wholly, but it feels like we're inching that way. So you get a kind of, in the very, very long run, it's kind of a cop out, because like you say that this political theorist, so in the long run this will happen. Well, how long exactly? Because if you just move the goalpost, change the timeline, you could say that they were vindicated whenever you want, right? But the idea that capitalism would eventually give way to communism, with the way the trends are going as far as information monopoly, centralized information held by a few giant firms, you might actually be able to overcome a calculation problem to some extent. I don't know.
Well, I think that the great benefit I see in the big tech innovations is not necessarily in like trying to gauge what the demand is for a good, although that's useful.
Yeah.
A lot of times they kind of have hack ways of doing that. I think that the real benefit is in the logistical networks that they've created. That, like, Amazon is probably the best example of this, and how they're able to now also manufacture, but it also distribute goods all over the country so effectively. I think that people overestimate the problem a lot of times, because you can algorithmically adjust supply to meet demand, even in a planning system, if so long as you have a market for the final consumer outputs. And that's kind of what Walmart and Amazon show us, is that you don't need intermediate markets or capital markets to do this. If you know what the end demand is, you can just adjust production accordingly. But what was I going to say? Oh,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of long trends, though, it's actually, and you mentioned like, oh, what is the time frame? It's actually kind of funny, because Mises's predictions about the downfall of the USSR, like, a lot of people give him credit in retrospect, but he was actually predicting that the USSR would collapse in the 30s because of this problem, when its growth was actually the highest, and a few years after the war.
In the 30s, its growth was the highest.
Yes, it had immense growth, even though there were big famines, and the reason was
it seemed to be,
because the reason was because industry was so much more productive than agriculture, and by forcibly taking the food and using it as inputs into industry for workers and so on, they were able to greatly expand the economy. It was a big human cost in doing that, but it had a big output. And this is something that institutional economics notes as well, that you can have these big outputs even by less sophisticated planning mechanisms.
Yeah, it seems to me the calculation debate really relies a lot on putting the dispersed consumer or kind of small scale producer and their desires first. There's a lot to be said for people and consumers and small time producers deciding what their outlays or what their budget might look like, the kind of things they want to buy, already being determined by firms. So it's, the firms are the dog and the consumer and small time producer are the tail, right? So, why can't they just take their cues from the bigger firms, rather than this notion that it's all of the most important information is being held in randomly distributed small time producers and consumers? I'm not so sure that even makes sense to think of it that way anymore, with so much of the centralization of marketing and everything happening now.
Yeah, I mean, it's always been somewhat true that like, people, their consumption choices aren't just like they're not always free choices. I mean, what's that classic line by Ford, that you can have any car you want, any color car you want, so long that it's black.
So how much is like, the kind of consumer preference uber alles, how much has that ever really been the case? I can see over the long term, consumer feedback shaping what firms produce. But, at any given time, it sure as hell doesn't feel like the consumers are in control.
Right. I mean,
certainly no individual consumer, maybe the aggregate.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, unless you're ordering things like custom to what you want, you're generally going to pick what's something from what's on the market, from like a menu or whatever, and you don't get to necessarily decide what that is. And it kind of creates an illusion of choice that I am free because I have all these different choices, whereas you have really no input on what kind of choices you're given to begin with.
Right. There's a information asymmetry as far as what the menu of goods and services that you could possibly even enjoy will ever be. That is, that's the information held by these firms. So, yeah, there's a lot to be said for consumer preferences really just being kind of a lagging indicator in some ways as to what is actually producible, really. So, yeah, I used to be very kind of big booster of markets, and then I started becoming friendlier to sort of like the producerist perspective. The different terms people have used: worker, producerist. Christopher Latch used producerist. I remember that, and just how it feels to be an adult with a job. You gain much more sense of identity from your work than what you consume generally. So I started kind of moving to almost kind of a more psychological even criticism of markets. I think a lot of the way that neoliberals describe markets working is actually correct, but I just feel like it's missing a big piece of the puzzle to human satisfaction or something. It's a little vague, I know, but
yeah, no, I mean, I think you're 100% correct there on the terms that you're talking about. I mean, there's no real. I mean, getting what do you call it? Absolute, like human. When you're trying to reach your goals or how you view yourself, that absolution, is that what it is?
Self-actualization.
Self-actualization. Like that's a very difficult thing to do, especially because so much of our time is done working for other people. And I mean,
yeah.
I think that the biggest possibility of increasing self-actualization is very basic, and it's just to decrease the work week. And the shorter the work week is, the more self-actualization you're going to have.
Yeah, I've wondered about a UBI, and I feel there's a certain strata of society that would not feel satisfied kicking back and collecting a UBI if they don't have a strong sense of self-actualization, what they would like to do with their time that is not tied to a job.
Mm-hmm.
There's some envy of the people who may make just as much money as you, make as much, obtain as much. You have a UBI. Let's say you've got a UBI, but you've got a friend who's working at Pixar or something. And multimedia artists making all these cool movies and stuff. There's, even though you've both got equal money coming in, even though that's a terrible example. Pixar would be making way more than UBI, but there's an envy of the person who can self-actualize through a job, because they're seeing their sense of self-actualization confirmed by strangers. Whereas you just would you're collecting a UBI, you've got a podcast, not that many people listen. There's envy for those who are employed in the traditional sense and not collecting UBI.
Well, I will say, I think that as you have more free time, and I think that, and this goes beyond, I think having a little bit of structure on time personally, I think is good, and having a job can help, whether you particularly like it or not, can help in that respect.
Yeah.
But if I was working like half the time that I do now and still had the same amount of money, I could use that other amount of time to create a kind of a hobbyist kind of production or whatever. I could be working on creating a video game with friends or writing or what have you. Like, I think a big problem to like the horizon of UBI is that we're so atomized as a society that we can't take advantage of it to the greatest extent. That we can't. It's hard to find other people to do these things with.
Yeah, I mean, there's a center right thinker named Brink Lindsay who did a book I think called "The Crisis of Abundance" or something like that, but talked about how you look at time use studies, time use diaries, and a lot of people have given a UBI would, a lot of men, I think it's focused on men, they would basically just be kicking back, playing video games, and watching Netflix. And yeah, there's some amount of social interaction that comes through, gaming with people online. I haven't been in the video game for a very long time, but I don't know how much that really is equal to whatever kind of face-to-face camaraderie or fellow feeling you get from an in-person job. On the other hand, I don't want to, kind of rely on some kind of Calvinist, you got to be out there working or you're just a bum. I don't really believe that either.
Yeah.
But, so it's a tough thing to unpack.
Oh, yeah. I think it would require just a different way of, like, of approach to, like, society outside of work. We have to have things like collective group activities and institutions that for people to spend their time in outside of just like playing video games and stuff. Like, I mean, I think our our social activities and stuff have atrophied so much.
Yeah. That's funny. That whole notion of anomie, alienation, atomization, that's like this high level theme that kind of unites the kind of smart left and right online. That kind of vague notion. Otherwise, they don't agree on too much, but that's the one thing they can seem to agree on. That there's this crisis of alienation going on.
Anyway. Yeah, I would agree with that. I have a blog, or not a blog. I have a Palladium article on this topic, just called "Do You Feel Lonely?" And it traces.
I'm sorry. What's it called?
It's just called "Do You Feel Lonely?" In Palladium, and it's just going through the history of atomization. And I think that the right, a lot of, there's a big anti-feminist presence on this a lot of times. It blames this on the cultural or the sexual revolution, and I think that's mistaken because the people who came before the sexual revolution felt the same way, and It just trend kept going.
Yeah, in the 50s, the kind of like early New Left writings were all about this theme of alienation. Before the now, of course, the harder right would say, well, no, there was a sexual revolution in the 50s as well, but I'm not going to get too deep into that. But the standard notion is that it happened in the 60s. So yeah, it predates that.
Yeah, I could argue, and like that it goes all the way back to just industrialization. And Engels actually wrote a bit about how atomizing like London was in this, like as industrialization was in full swing, and how it kind of broke up like the old social ties that people had. And just also just like the new apartment tenant living situations that they had. And that's a trend that's been just increasing over time, is that the single family or single individual housing situations is steadily increased just ever since industrialization.
Yeah. Well, with that said, we've been talking for an hour, so I think I'll wrap it up. Thanks for talking, Nicolas. Take care.
No problem. Bye.